plucking ducks that are like diver ducks. Like we shoot a lot of redheads on the coast, and it's like 50-50 on whether or not they taste good. But that fat carries a lot of flavor. So when you keep the skin on, you're keeping the fat. And so that fat will carry over. And we did a lot of waterfowl hunting, and a huge snowstorm came like right before we got there. And so there was several feet of snow on the ground, and God, it was like late October, but a lot of the water had already frozen over except for the moving creeks. And so that's kind of where all the waterfowl congregated. And we found one spot with a whole bunch of mallards, and we shot a good handful of mallards, and they were really muddy tasting. When we were cleaning them, always check the crop. There's just so much green vegetation that they were eating because there is no food on the ground. And it's amazing. Even something like a mallard, a dabbling duck that you usually associate with being like the best to eat, especially if they're, out in a cornfield or something. It's amazing how fast their meat can change based on what they're eating. And so I was like really disheartened when I started to taste those mallards. So the rest of the mallards in that group that we had shot off that river, I took the skin off. Even though I had already plucked them, after all that work, I still took the skin off because they tasted so muddy.
All right, everybody, welcome back to another episode of GDIY. We are joined by Danielle Prewett of Wild and Hold. Danielle, thanks for taking the time to come on and talk to us about cooking and homesteading and gardening and whatever else that we're going to get into today.
Yeah, hi. Thank you so much for having me on.
Yeah. So for the listeners that may not be familiar with who you are and what you do, why don't you provide a little background, tell everybody what you do and how you kind of fell into this crazy world?
Yeah, so I like to say that I have the best job in the world. I get to travel around hunting, fishing, and teach other people how to cook with wild foods. I'm a wild food content creator for Meateater, and I have two bird dogs. My oldest is a golden. She's a little red swamp collie. And then I have a Deutsch Drahthaar. So we do a lot of bird hunting. That's kind of where my passion lies when it comes to outdoor pursuits. But yeah, that's kind of the short end of the story.
Did one overshadow the others in regards to what brought you to this degree of involvement? Like, were you more of a gardener, fisher, hunter? Like, talk to me about like what really got your foot in the door.
Well, I was a foodie first and foremost. I loved food. I wanted to cook really good food, and I knew that I wanted to eat sustainably, and hunting just sort of became the absolute answer for finding that, both in terms of like being able to connect to my food, harvest the animal was really important to me. But from like a food perspective, you really can't eat any better than wild game because it's just such a unique thing you can't get at the grocery store. And so I was really enamored with that. So food came first, and then dogs came after that. So my husband's an avid outdoorsman. He's the one who really got me into everything. He's the one who started bringing game home for me to cook. And then when we got our bird dogs, naturally I wanted, as a proud mama, wanted to see them perform in the field, and like just seeing a dog's excitement and the energy level and the pride that they have doing what they love to do, but doing what they were bred to do just was like a hook, line, and sink. And so I kept going out in the field just because I loved watching the dogs. And it all sort of snowballed into like one day my husband's like, if you carry a gun, we can carry more. Like, because I would just follow around in the field with the camera just because I had fun. I just enjoyed being out there. And then I picked up a gun, got my hunter safety, started shooting. And then, yeah, the rest is history.
I love it. I think a lot of people can relate to that story, for whatever brings you to the outdoor space in general, whether it's food or the hunting or the dogs. It seems like when you add a dog, it inevitably it hooks people even more to where you're not just doing it just for yourself, even though if you are primarily doing it for food, there's still a sense of you're doing it for the dog, regardless of to what degree you get involved in this or not. Just adding the dog, and you have your best friend, you have your, quote unquote kid with you out there all the time. It just adds a fun element that I think my listeners can all relate to, and to some
Oh,
degree
yeah.
anyway.
And it's funny now that I've hunted behind my dog so much. When I hunt without my dog, I'm like, this isn't as fun. Like
Yeah.
I hate to admit it, but I'm like, it is way more fun when you're with your dog. I think it's I don't know. I mean, we could go on and on about the reasons why that is. But yeah.
Yeah, I'm with you. I love sharing the field with any dog. I love watching dogs work, but you just lose something if it's not your own dog. And
Yeah.
yeah, again, we can all relate to that. I want to get your take because you've already said it once. I think I already said it. The word sustainable, and that word gets thrown around a whole lot. It can take on a whole bunch of different meanings, but whether you're hunting, fishing, foraging, gardening, even raising your own livestock or whatnot, why is it so important nowadays that people are really starting to pay attention to where their food comes from and whether it's a sustainable resource or not?
Yeah, I used the word sustainable earlier because when I was first getting into this, that was sort of the introduction into this world. But I wanted to figure out what that really meant. And I discovered through my time in the outdoors that it meant really eating consciously and connecting to food and eating consciously in a way that the more time I spent outdoors, the more I realized kind of what my impact was on wildlife and the habitats. The more time I spent in the field hunting, the more I realized, the roles that agriculture plays into the wildlife, especially bird hunting. Um, Agriculture plays such an important role, and starting to really think about how important those habitats are and what are the choices that I'm making, how are those affecting habitats and wildlife. And so I wrote a book called Wild and Whole, a cookbook, not a novel. It felt like writing a novel. A cookbook called Wild and Whole. And the introduction chapter talks about eating consciously because this became such an important passion of mine. That I wanted to really share what inspired me to write that book. And it was being outdoors in the field and learning what food sustainability meant from the perspective of an outdoorsman or outdoorswoman. Because I don't think that's a story that's told much. I think we hear a lot about it in terms of like vegan versus carnivore or regenerative agriculture is like really taking the spotlight and some of those things, and I think those are all really important, but I think one of the biggest threats we have today is not so much carbon emissions but the loss of biodiversity, and food production plays a really big role in loss of biodiversity, and as hunters we should really care about that because I mean, that's what's sustaining the wildlife that we have access to hunt, whether it's public or private. So that's kind of a deep dive that I took into it, and why it's important to me. I think um, people should feel inspired by it to get outside and connect to their food and whatever means possible. It may not always be wild game, but whether that means connecting to a local farmer or foraging or starting a garden. But I think we can all remember what it was like during COVID when the supply chain issue was interrupted. And that's sort of the result and the demise of a centralized food system. And so the more you sort of decentralize, kind of get shop local, the less fear and issues you have with that food supply chain. People didn't know how to get meat. People didn't know how to get their food, and surprisingly, people really freaked out about buying toilet paper during that time. I don't
Right.
don't understand that part of it all, but like I can understand being afraid of not having meat or eggs at a grocery store, but the toilet paper was really funny. Uh, anyway, yeah.
Yeah, it's, I can relate to so much of what you're saying. When I first got into hunting years ago, I was your typical, entry level hunter to where I was really, quote unquote, bloodthirsty. I was out there. It's like I wanted to shoot limits. I wanted to shoot a lot. I wanted to bring home a lot of birds. I wanted to bring home deer. I wanted to do all of that. But then through doing that, and the we talk about the levels of hunters that we kind of progress through, you start noticing kind of how everything relies on each other and everything comes full circle. To your point, it's not just hunting and the wildlife, but that brings in habitat. Well, how do we create habitat? You need diversity, and then you get into pollinators, and then fast forward from me just hunting, putting my foot in the door and starting hunting, fast forward a decade or so, and here I am with my own piece of property, and I'm bringing back native grasses. I'm doing the pollinator stuff. I'm raising my own meat birds. I have eggs. And to your point, during COVID, when everybody was freaking out, even people within my own family, they're, how are you getting this? How are you getting that? And it's like, I have a freezer full of game that I've shot throughout my hunting trips. I have eggs over here. I have a vegetable garden. And to your point, whether you have access to that in your own backyard or not, the local community, the farmers markets, stuff like that, there's options for everybody to, like you said, find the local farmer, because the regenerative ag and rotational grazing, it is more popular. It is growing in popularity, and it's only going to get easier and easier to find. So if you're listening to this and you haven't really found success in hunting and stacking the freezer with a whole bunch of birds yet, there are other options to still live within that kind of wholesome lifestyle, regardless of whether you live in an area that has a bunch of game opportunities or bird opportunities.
Yeah, and like I've spent a little bit of time researching regenerative agriculture. I got to hang out with Will Harris at White Oak Pastures and learn quite a bit from him. And as important as that is in the way to move forward, I think some of those big changes really start with policy changes, because right now it's an extremely expensive way to farm. And it's not really realistic, I think, for every consumer to be like, I'm going to go buy all my meat from a regenerative farmer, because it's really expensive. And so in thinking about this book and what's realistic for people who are not going to be able to hunt for all their food, or maybe not like afford all everything to be regenerative or even grass fed, I find that even just supporting your local farmer, even if it's like grass fed, grain finished, buying one whole cow from them is so important, just to support your local communities. In researching this book, I read a statistic that only 17 cents of every dollar spent goes back to the farmer who grew or raised whatever it is that you're consuming, which is not very much. So the bulk of everything goes to the middleman and all the steps in between. So yeah, I think, putting your money back into your community and just supporting that is pretty important.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was recently reading a quick little just blurb on the cost of chicken 40, 50 years ago compared to now, and how the pretty much the injection, the antibiotics, the way we grow them, and how they've kind of inflated and gotten so big. Whereas a chicken used to cost $3, by being able to produce them in the mass, grow houses that they do now, the equivalency to what we used to pay for chicken, around $3, is about $30 a chicken now. And after me doing some, pasture raised chickens on my own place, I ended up with about a 4 pound bird, and doing all the costs and everything, I break even at about $7 a pound, which is $28 to $30. And so when you look at it like that, then you go to the grocery store and it's like, I can get this whole chicken for $9 at Walmart or whatever. Or I can have this sustainably grown and pasture raised chicken that is not only going to be better for me, but it's also going to taste better.
Much better.
It's hard to, when people are strapped for cash and budget wise, like, it's hard to say that you need to order this or pay for that. But if you actually have an interest in doing things sustainably, that is important to do, to where you know that that bird was raised on grass, on bugs, the way it was meant to be, and not in some grow house in a cage. And I say all this just because while everybody listening to this is a bird hunter of some sort, we all don't really live in a bird rich environment. You know, I'm in Tennessee, and there's really no way to actually really stock up the freezer with wild game unless you're a deer hunter. And so, either way, you're incurring the cost to get that food, whether you're traveling to South Dakota or you're paying extra for a local farmer. Either way, if you want to eat the more sustainable grown food, you're paying for it either way somehow.
That's funny. You mentioned most people can't live off birds. The first year I, I wanted to try and only eat wild game. Um, Stop buying meat from the grocery store. And this was about 10 years ago. And we had just moved to North Dakota. And um, it's so funny. That first year that I decided to do this, I told my husband, he was like, hell yeah, I'm on board. Basically, you're telling me to hunt more. And he was like, yes.
I love it.
But we didn't shoot a deer that year. And so like, how are we gonna do this? But he was an avid waterfowl hunter as well. And so like, oh my God, the amount of ducks and geese we were eating, and we weren't getting picky either, like we had some diver ducks in there too. Um, which I could have gone to the store at any time and bought meat. And there were definitely a few times where I caved in and bought meat because I was like, this is hard. Um, but yeah, that's so funny. Like we were living primarily on waterfowl was our source of red meat. Um, and I say we probably made a pretty good dent in the population of pheasants that year. And then, a lot of cottontails in the winter and just sort of being as opportunistic as possible. But that was the first year we decided to do that. And then afterwards we started shooting some bigger game animals, and that alleviated the need to eat diver ducks.
Right. It that's funny. It's yeah, if you only want to fill up your freezer with one type of bird, that can be tricky depending on where you live. But diversifying your freezer, going after different types of birds, waterfowl, venison, throw in some turkey, throw in some squirrel meat, rabbits, what have you. It's surprising. I do have a couple buddies that do manage to really live off of what they kill hunting, and they don't buy any meat from the freezer. But it is almost a weekly devotion of, we're going to go out and acquire it.
It was an absolute grind. We lived that way for about 10 years, only eating wild game. Every now and then I'd buy like a turkey for Thanksgiving, and like there were moments like that, but or if we go out to eat, I'm eating meat. One of the other ways that we really learned to stretch the freezer, well, two different ways we learned to stretch the freezer was eating nose to tail. I did not let hearts and livers from birds go to waste. That went into my breakfast scramble with potatoes, made a little hash with potatoes. And then I ate a lot more vegetables. I started introducing meatless meals, which at the time, it sounds ironic, to be like so pro meat, but also I really fell in love with cooking and eating vegetables. And it made the meat stretch and made everything seem more valuable, and I appreciated the nights that we did have meat. We weren't like starving by any means, but I'm not trying to make it sound like this was like some sort of hardship, because we could just it wasn't at all. It was just me being really stubborn. That's all it comes down to. But yeah.
I mean, if you're gonna set a goal and intention, then let's see it through. Let's actually try and do it, because you could have easily just tapped out and gone and buy meat, but let's figure out, how do we make it stretch longer. I love it.
Yeah, and yeah, and how to utilize more of the animal, like because it's so easy when you just have an abundance to just be like, "Ah, I don't want to eat that. I don't want to eat the legs or whatever." It's so easy to do that, and then so that taught me a really valuable lesson in eating the whole animal and appreciating it. But yeah, we did that for about 10 years, and wild game is still the primary part of our diet now. But as I have gotten a little older and really started thinking more about conservation and sustainability in a bigger lens, I realize how important our farmers are to the wildlife I pursue. And so it became important to me to support them. Um, and so, yeah, I'll buy from my local farmers pork, beef, and chicken, just because it feels good to give money back to the community that are raising animals in a holistic way.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned going back to the waterfowl. You know that was primarily your red meat option, and but then you referenced also there's a difference between your divers and your puddle ducks, right? And there's different classifications within kind of the different species within the waterfowl. I want to go down that hole a little bit because it's the same way in upland birds. You know, different birds kind of give you a different quality of meat. It gives you a different type of fat. It gives you a different quality of skin and all that stuff. How, let's talk about, let's just stick with the waterfowl first and qualify. Like, do you have, let's start off with, do you have a hard set rule to where like you pluck every bird, or do you skin them or breast them? Because I think this is a big topic amongst people, especially in the waterfowl people, where if you shoot a diver duck, you're not plucking that whole thing if you ask the average person. I'm curious your thoughts as to the whole pluck versus skin versus breast out mentality.
Well, I'll start by saying I don't shoot diver ducks anymore. I believe if you shoot it, you should eat it. And I'm not as hungry as I used to be, I should say. Um, no, but as far as like whether or not to pluck, I mean, there's nothing I love more than a beautiful fat mallard breast that has been plucked and the skin is crispy on the outside when seared. I love it. That said, I think you should pluck. You don't have to pluck everything. I think there's so many times where you get an animal that's been mutilated by a dog or just shot to shit. There's really no point in plucking it because by the time you have that skin's really torn up and you're not really going to eat and enjoy the skin when you can see like the blood residue and then feathers, and it's just like it's less enjoyable at that point than it is to just take the skin off. But if you are eating diver ducks or like woodcock would be a great example of a duck that or a bird that whose diet really plays a heavy role in the flavor of the meat. That's really found in the fat. So that's why if you're plucking ducks that are like diver ducks, like we shoot a lot of redheads on the coast and it's like 50-50 on whether or not they taste good. But that fat carries a lot of flavor. So when you keep the skin on, you're keeping the fat. And so that fat will carry over. But it's interesting. You mentioned this last year. We went to North Dakota. We go to North Dakota. We lived in North Dakota for a while. Now we live in Texas, but we miss it so much. So every year we travel back north to hunt, and we did a lot of waterfowl hunting, and a huge snowstorm came like right before we got there, and so there was several feet of snow on the ground, and God, it was like late October, but a lot of the water had already frozen over except for the moving creeks. Any moving water was still open. And so that's kind of where all the waterfowl congregated. And we found one spot with a whole bunch of mallards, and we shot a good handful of mallards. And they were really muddy tasting. When we were cleaning them, always check the crop. There's just so much green vegetation that they were eating because there is no food on the ground. Everything's covered in snow. And so they're eating probably a lot more aquatic species and insects and that green that's in the water. And it's amazing. Even something like a mallard a dabbling duck that you usually associate with being like the best to eat, especially if they're, out in a cornfield or something, it's amazing how fast their meat can change based on what they're eating. Um, and so I was like really disheartened when I started to taste those mallards. So the rest of the mallards in that group that we had shot off that river, I took the skin off. Even though I had already plucked them, I still took the skin off after all that work, I still took the skin off because they tasted so muddy.
Now, would you check the crop? Like, will you make a game time decision in real time if you check the crop and you see a bunch of stuff that you don't really care for?
Well, at the time, I'm like, all dabbler ducks are good. Like I didn't really, oh, what? So like a couple days of eating some green grass vegetate. What is that gonna? It's still gonna taste great. And the meat was fine. Once you took the skin off, the meat was just fine. But the skin was definitely strong in flavor. Um, but I think, yeah. So moving forward, I would definitely check the crop. And with upland species, I check the crop all the time just because I'm like always curious what they're eating, where can I find, where am I going to find more of these birds um, from like a hunting perspective. But for ducks, I haven't typically checked the crop that much just because if you're hunting in a field, you know what they're eating. You know, it's just kind of obvious. But I think that is kind of an important lesson in how incredibly diverse and unique wild game can be. I hear so many hunters, they kind of have one bird that tasted one way, and then their mind is set that all of these birds for the rest of the time will always taste this way. And they get it in their head like these snow geese are terrible. All snow geese are terrible. And that's just really not the way it works. If you're constantly eating this shooting and hunting ducks and eating them in the same location every single year. And every time you're like, they taste bad. And then in your head, you're like, this species tastes bad. It's not necessarily the species, unless it's a diver duck, then it's probably the species. But it's not, like there are so many other factors. It's the location that you're hunting and what they're consistently eating that is giving it that flavor. So I always tell people like, if you don't like the way your ducks taste and you're shooting them in the same spot, hunt somewhere else. Hunt a field. Change it up.
Yeah, it's funny because I've had friends they've shot a mallard or wood duck or something like that. They go home and cook it, and they text or call me, and they're like, "Man, this really wasn't that good." And I automatically assume like, "Well, it's not a diver duck. Like you just prepared it wrong." And to your point, it really could be what they were eating recently. Because
Yeah.
if I'm sorry, if you get a wood duck that's been crunching on some acorns on the edge of a swamp, that they're going to be really good. But it's interesting. You can't just apply a hard set rule to where you hear all the time like duck's one of the best things that you can have if you prepare it right. And there is probably a little bit more context that goes into that. You mentioned snow geese, and when I was in college, I was dirt poor, living off of fish that I caught or whatever I hunted, and I was not a good hunter at this time. And there was the snow goose conservation season in Arkansas, and we went out and we just stacked them. I mean, we got like 85 snow geese in one day. And the other guys didn't want any of the birds because it's snow geese. It tastes bad. And I was a poor college student. I lived off of snow geese for like a year after that.
Oh, I know that. Yeah.
Yeah.
We've done the same thing. I mean, that like what I was saying early on when we decided to only eat wild game, the conservation season was kind of like the bulk of getting our red meat because a lot of other people, well, my husband is the waterfowl fanatic, and he and his buddy Rhett Hall, who's got a drought hard kennel up there, they would get into an enclosed trailer and stay the night out there, put the decoys out, stay the night, and hunt hard. And I mean, they'd come home and they'd be like, "All right, we shot 60 birds," and that was like one weekend, and we divvied it up, and it would be like, and they would just do this every single weekend, and so I kind of got to where like I couldn't I processed a lot of the bird. I did a lot of the butchering and processing, and I couldn't really keep up. Unlike a deer where you get a whole deer, you process it all at once. Like it was just like this revolving door of just geese coming in all the time. And so I'd start this system where I would hang them in the garage for 3 5 days till I could get to each one because I would just get so tired of cleaning birds. And it was a grind. I don't think I've ever been so exhausted during those first couple years. But yeah, man, talk about bloodthirsty. Travis, my husband, it was a little bit of just bloodthirst, but also like wanted a full freezer of meat, and it was it was exhausting.
Trust me, I'm reliving my time to where it took a solid day or something to just process that amount of geese, and that wasn't even plucking. That wasn't doing. I mean, it was
Yeah,
just
yeah.
yeah. It takes a good bit of time. I'm curious going into the upland space. You mentioned woodcock as far as the fat and skin. I'm curious as far as the other upland birds because they're genuinely dry birds. They're on land. You can count on their diet to be a little bit more consistent in terms of the seeds or the bugs or whatever they're eating at that point in time. Do you kind of go about it the same way, kind of take it as it comes, whether you skin it or
No,
pluck
they're
it?
more consistent, but I think what people have a challenge with understanding when it comes to upland species is that they think, okay, it's a bird, so like let's treat all of the birds like chicken and cook it well done. And if you feed a big enough variety, there's sage and sharptail and like dove are so dark meat, and that it to me should be treated like a duck, eaten medium rare. And so it's kind of like this like it's not like white meat, dark meat. I like to think of it as a little bit of a sliding scale, as pheasants and some other grouse species are on the whiter side that you do want to kind of treat similar to a chicken. And then my favorite, somewhere not necessarily in the middle, but Hungarian partridge, I think are really unique birds because they're just a little bit more blush pink than a pheasant, and I think that they can kind of be cooked a little bit more blush and not all cooked all the way through, but not something you would want to eat medium rare like a sharp tail or dove. So that's the kind of the way that I think about upland species, but you can rely within that category of species that they'll all generally taste the same.
Yeah. Yeah, everybody assumes just because it's a dry bird and it's not a duck that everything is white meat, but to your point, sharptail and prairie chickens, once you see the breasts within those species for the first time, it honestly surprises a lot of people of how dark that meat is. And I've struggled to where I'm a pretty simple cook. Like if I'm the type of person that if I open up a recipe and there's 15 to 20 ingredients or that ingredient list goes to the second page, I just go to another recipe. So like I'm very cut and dry, simple, especially on the red meat. Like cook it hot and fast and medium rare, and I'm happy. But it's been a struggle getting my wife. She usually loves all the wild game meat, but the prairie chicken and sharptails doesn't agree with her like that, like everything else. So I'm curious, how do you handle the red meat? Do you always kind of do an extended recipe, or can you kind of church that up with the right seasoning or marinade or something to where you can do it that fast?
I think there's a couple different ways of looking at it. I think you can't go wrong with salt, pepper, cooking it medium rare if it's a dark breasted bird. I don't get to shoot a lot of sharp-tailed grouse. They're my favorite birds to hunt, and they're the birds you work the hardest for. I feel like you work so hard for those birds and you bring one home like I'm here to celebrate this bird and I want to make it special. Um and so for those I have a recipe in my cookbook coming out with a little raspberry sauce, and incredibly simple. It was sort of inspired by a hunt I did a few years back. I wanted to go on a upland hunt by myself. I'd almost always hunt with my husband. And this year, I wanted to just go alone for a little bit because I think there's a lot of satisfaction to gain, partially from me myself being able to make my own decisions about where to go and how I wanted to approach things, but also because you know I wanted to experience the bond with my bird dog. I always joke that whenever I'm hunting with Travis, I feel like the third wheel on a date because I hated the way Z was working for him. And if Travis would turn his chest a little one way, Z would look back and move that way. And I would just get so, I just felt like they were in sort of this working relationship and I was just the third person following around and it drove me insane. And I wanted that experience with the dog. And so that's why I went by myself and I started in the Sandhills, Nebraska, sharp-tail hunting. And I was really surprised by how hard that was. The grass was really tall and the birds were running on us everywhere. And when they did get up and fly, they were out of range and they were gone. So I did that for a couple days, and then I drove into the grasslands on the western part of North Dakota, where I knew the area well because I used to live there and hunt there a lot, so I kind of knew where to go. Um, and so yeah, I did a sharp-tailed grouse hunt out there. And it took me a couple days to find the birds, and it started snowing, and it was just really cold and me and Z were really dead tired. And then I finally found them. They were eating on buffalo berries. If you ever see those out there. And so after I got a bird, I like grabbed a whole bunch of those berries and stuck it in my pocket. And those berries are really tart, tiny tart little red berries. They kind of look like yopon berries if you're from the South, but they're not yopons. Anyways, and so that was kind of like the basis for what the recipe is I wanted to pair this bird with the berries that they had been eating. So back home I didn't have any of the berries left because I left them in my bird bag to get smashed and rot like an idiot. um, but so back home when I was like, the perfect substitute is actually frozen raspberries because raspberries themselves are tons of tiny little berries, all sort of, there's a name for that. I forgot what it's called. But whenever you take frozen raspberries and you defrost them, they're kind of all mushy and juicy. And so the pan sauce comes together really fast after you sear the meat. A little aromatics like onion, a splash of chicken stock, and some of that berries and some butter to finish. Doesn't take long to whip up, but that acidity pairs really well with the sharp-tailed grouse. Any kind of dark meat like that, acidity pairs really well.
Nice. Yeah, that does sound simple, and it's one of those. Again, going back to when I first started, my lifestyle was a little different. I could afford to spend hours upon hours creating this really good dish, and I love doing that. And to this day, I would prefer to do that. But life's gotten a little hectic. You add in the kid, you add in the property, multiple dogs to train, and you want to go hunt and whatnot. It's important to me that a recipe such as that, it's actually realistic to do on just a weeknight rather than like, oh, this weekend we have company into town, let's actually spend a half a day actually trying to put something good together. And that's why a recipe like that sounds like something that I would be willing to try. And you said it's in the new cookbook, right?
Yeah, I think when you hear pan sauce or when some people hear pan sauce, they're immediately really intimidated. And it's something that's the pan is already there with all the crackling and brown bits at the bottom. All you have to do is just basically clean it by adding the liquid. And so it comes together fast. But no, I understand what you're saying of, you know, there's definitely two buckets of needing the quick weeknight meal to kind of get you fed, but also enjoy it. And then there's the other one where for me, it's like I worked my ass off for this bird. I really want to treasure this and celebrate it. What do I make to celebrate it? So yeah, so I find myself creating two different types of recipes for those occasions.
Yeah, that's a great way of putting it because I find myself in that camp all the time to where I need a quick meal. I've got chicken over here and then I've got pheasant or rough grouse over here, and I don't really want to like I don't know, bring the pheasant and grouse down to the level of the just regular chicken almost. I want to do it justice and, like you said, celebrate it. But then what happens is life gets crazy, and next thing you know, I'm 8 months removed from the hunting season when I shot the bird, and I still haven't cooked it because I've been waiting on that special occasion or that cool recipe to try.
Yeah. Yeah, I find myself in that situation all the time. I hoard my freezer like nobody's business. It's always waiting for that special occasion where I don't know why I do it. It's really annoying.
Now, I'm assuming that's kind of an opportunistic thing. It's not going to be the case in every situation where you get to take a bird. Do you always try and kind of couple what they're eating, if it's edible by us, to within the dish? You know, you mentioned sharp tails with the buffalo berries, and also like you can find them in rose hips, so you can collect the rose hips pretty often through that. Do you always kind of have that in the back of your mind? If the opportunity presents itself, you will, but it's not like a priority for you.
I don't think it's a priority. I think it just depends on my mood. I mean, like another thing with like say sharptail, for example, and mule deer, any kind of species that is in that sort of sagebrush habitat. Um, I actually really enjoy pairing it with sage. Um, Granted, the sage habitat is actually in the sunflower family, and I've read that it can be toxic. So I haven't tried eating it for that reason. Um, but it still smells like Thanksgiving to me. And I think a lot of people try to cover up that sage flavor, especially in like antelope or something like that. And I think it's actually something that's a really nice grassy quality that I like to pull out. And so I'll just like put a little fresh sage with salt and pepper into a rub and pair it. So in certain cases, I will sort of try to kind of go with the what grows together goes together mentality, but not all the time. I think it's just sometimes when the opportunity presents itself, but I don't think you have to.
Right. I'm curious, this is a challenge that I've kind of seen in myself is I kind of fall into my comfort corner. I find one or two things that works and then I just keep repeating it over and over and over again. And I find myself I think it's more of a lack of education standpoint or familiarity with different approaches, whether it's like, oh, this time I want to really season it, or this time marinate it, or let it sit overnight in this milk bath or whatever. You hear that all the time. Can we talk about the principles of just cooking in general, whether this is wild game or not? Like, can you give us some kind of just steer us in the right direction on how best to go about preparing your meat for whichever method that you want to continue with, given the recipe that you're doing?
Well, I think if you really want to just simplify it, I always say there's only two ways of cooking, either hot and fast or low and slow. Hot and fast cooking means any kind of searing, grilling, anything over high heat for a short amount of time. And that's best for anything that's going to be really tender. So on an upland bird, all the breast meat, essentially. Low and slow is sort of the low heat for a long period of time so that meat can really tenderize. And that's, applicable for the thighs. Um, and and so I really just think about it in those two different things. And it's basic simplicity of, yeah, if you want just like the foundational way of doing something, the hot and fast is like whether you want to have a dry rub or a marinade or whatever you want to do, that's the key foundation is you don't want to overcook the meat. It's so lean and it dries out so quickly. So you only have to cook it for a short amount of time. However, if you want to get those really nice brown flavors that sort of make your mouth water, you have to use really high heat. If you use medium-ish heat, by the time you're sitting there waiting for that brown color exterior crust to develop, you've already overcooked the meat. So that's why I say really hot and really fast for that. Unless you're doing something like sous vide, which is, I mean, that's its own thing that I would consider that low and slow. But for as far as like the opposite with like legs, um, any kind of slow cook recipe, all you need to remember is to brown the meat first, because all you're doing there is not trying to cook it. You're just trying to develop flavor, and then just submerge it with some sort of aromatics and some sort of liquid, and just cook it over low heat until it falls apart. Which, like, rule of thumb for pheasant legs is usually about 4 hours.
Hmm.
Like 300 degrees or something or lower. If you want to up the temperature, it can go about 3 to 3.5 hours. But the higher temperature you cook for that long, the more juices you tend to lose, and the drier the meat gets to be. So I always kind of be careful with that.
Yeah, when you're checking whether the meat is done or not, is it when you're cooking low and slow, is it a good rule of thumb, like if the meat's just easily pulling from the bone? I mean, is there a good hard set rule for that?
No, just grab it out of the pot. If it's falling apart, that's great. If you can't take a fork and pull it off, then do you really want to sit there and gnaw on it? No, I don't. I mean, yeah, it's just as easy as just sticking a fork in it.
Well, now what about when let's go back to the skillet example, or whichever way you want to prepare the meat. For somebody first learning how to cook, with in general, the difference with oils and fats and different things that you're going to use in a pan or something like that, what's a good, just kind of foundational level knowledge or tip in regards to when to use butter or when to use olive oil or whatnot?
Um, well, almost every cooking method, whether you're going to sear it in a skillet or put it on the grill or even slow cook it, you're almost always going to use high heat to develop that brown flavor. So you need something with a high smoke point oil, or a oil with a high smoke point. My first choice, first and foremost, is chicken schmaltz always. I think it imparts a meaty flavor. But I don't always have chicken schmaltz, and it's kind of expensive to buy at the grocery store. So if you can get it, use it. If not, not a big deal. After that, I usually use a neutral oil. I like avocado oil. Canola oil is also, canola and grapeseed are also neutral flavored high smoke point oils. And the point of having it a neutral flavored oil is that you're not going to add or take away from the flavor of whatever you're cooking. So, I mean, whatever oil you use is going to add some sort of flavor, unless it's a neutral flavor. And so that's why I tend to use those a lot, is because it's not going to mess with the flavor of the dish. And after that, it really comes down to other oils that do have some sort of flavor. Just, does it go with whatever you're cooking? Butter tends to burn. I only use butter at the very, very end, but you can use clarified butter or ghee. And that's great if you've got a sauce or you've got some sort of recipe that already has butter in it later on, or cream or cheese or any kind of dairy. Then you would want to use that.
Hmm. Now, as far as the cooking methods, you mentioned sous vide just a minute ago. You have smokers, you have grilling, you can bake, you can roast, you have all this type of stuff. Is there, obviously it comes down to preference, what you're actually trying to accomplish, but what's your kind of preferred outlook as to choosing the correct method for whatever you're trying to do? I know you said high and fast, slow and low, but what's your preferred methods of cooking when it comes to kind of wild game?
All of them. they're all tools in the toolbox. It's just about utilizing like those tool. If you're going to grill something because you want that smoke flavor, as long as that grill is ripping hot. If you want something that, if you've got a leg that's really tough, but maybe you want to infuse smoke flavor, I'll brine it overnight, put it on the smoker for an hour or two, and then drop it in a crock pot with onions, carrots, celery, and beans for like a hearty winter stew. Um, so just yeah, it's the hot and fast and low and slow. They still apply. It's just a matter of choosing the tool, I guess.
Yeah. And I mean, it's kind of just a general, just preference question. It's hard to answer that without the context and what you're actually after. I'm curious. This is one of those strange questions, just personal preference. If you could only select one cooking method, that's the only one you get to use for the rest of your life. What would be your choice in that instance?
Well, you would have to tell me. The problem is the birds have tough parts and tender parts, so it's not fair question. Um, but I wouldn't want to have to eat legs. I wouldn't want to have to shoot gnaw on legs all the time. So I would probably have to go with some sort of braise because you can a breast meat is still really good once it's braised in the oven and it's shredding apart, but thigh is not good. Just cooked really hot and fast.
Yeah, love it. I got you. I referenced earlier, you hear all the time about people just say like, oh, soak it in buttermilk overnight or whatnot. There's a whole bunch of different stuff. The only way I grew up and ever had venison was just in a puddle of cream of mushroom soup, right? There's all kinds of crazy stuff out there that people do. What are some of the biggest or more common, I don't want to call it mistakes or errors, but like stuff that you would just kind of direct people like, hey, if you just kind of change this, it would help you out? What are some of the more common mistakes or errors you see people doing with wild game meat?
Um, I think, well, going to the milk subject, I think a lot of people use milk in order to pull the flavor or gaminess out or to tenderize it. And I'll say that I did a little research into it. There's definitely, some truth to that working. If you've ever left a gallon of milk open in the refrigerator, that milk's absorbing the flavors in your fridge, and it's very similar effect into meat, and so it can be effective. Unfortunately, milk imparts its own flavor to meat, and that can be good and that can be bad. If you've got quail and you want to batter that up and deep fry it, I think buttermilk is a great way, great marinade. Buttermilk fried quail, hell yeah. Now, if you've got sharp-tailed grouse and you want a steak and you soak it in milk, you've got milk steak.
That doesn't sound appetizing at all.
No, I always think of Charlie from It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia. You see how different that is. The milk will impart its own flavor, and the milk will turn the meat really gray and visually unappealing to me. And so it's just something to consider, whether or not that's a good idea. I personally don't soak meat in milk unless it's a white bird that I plan to fry or like yogurt. Like I love Middle Eastern, Greek food, Mediterranean. Like I love like pheasant, like kebabs like that have been marinated in yogurt and then on the grill. Like so that's like a different scenario of when dairy is an appropriate choice. But I think soaking a steak, a red meat for a steak in milk is unappealing to me. Now that said, there's also recipes where you can braise food in milk, and that's its own thing. But yeah, it just kind of it's a personal preference. I have my preferences, what I wouldn't do. I think at this point, for other people, I think the most important thing is that you really enjoy what you're eating and appreciate it. and that's all that really matters. Who gives a shit what I say? If you love that, then great. Don't let me tell you different. If you don't like it and you're bashing on your snow goose because you've been soaking in better milk, maybe try not doing that.
Yeah. Yeah, you would think that that might be, common sense, but yeah, you're right, and you're the one eating it, so if you like it, okay, more power to you. So, I think a lot of people, at least people that I've shared camp with or something, I don't think that they fully recognize that how a dish ends up, how you end up cooking it, really goes all the way back to the field care and how quickly you got to, butchering the animal. I'm curious your tips on that. Like, how fast does it change by species? Have you messed with dry aging? Talk to us about field care.
I've had more bad experiences with aging birds, and I think a lot of it comes down to where the bird is shot. If a bird is shot anywhere in its intestines, you're going to make that meat spoil the fastest. If you know for sure that you are shooting a bird that is flying away from you, you shot it in its ass. I'll just be frank. You need to clean that really quickly because it will smell if you leave it to hang. If you got a nice side shot and you've let it and you're like, I shot it right in the head, like that's a great candidate to dry age and let it hang overnight. And I think there's nothing wrong with doing that. But I've had more experiences where it's been shot in the guts and it will taint the meat when you can smell it when you go to clean it and you're pulling the guts out. You can smell it. And the meat can be tainted just a little bit. Sometimes it's so faint, but it's enough to be there that if you're introducing this meat to somebody who's never had wild game, they're going to pick it up immediately. And that's the first thing they're going to smell, and they're going to automatically associate that with wild game. So I think where the animal is shot, it makes a really big deal.
Mm. It's you just raised the situation of you're introducing wild game to somebody brand new, and this can kind of make or break somebody's perspective of not only eating wild game but the hunting culture and industry and community as a whole, right? Very often I know I've gotten people interested in hunting and by extension dog training and bird hunting just by cooking them a good meal of, a bird's eye shot somewhere else. It's, what are some of the considerations when we do have somebody completely foreign to wild game? Are there some kind of guidelines that you could say, like, keep it simple, don't go over this? Like, do we want to start with prairie chicken, like a bold flavored meat, or would we prefer to do it like
Yeah,
rough
I think it
grouse
depends
more?
on the person and how adventurous they are. But if it is something that's really big and bold flavored, like okay, I had some when we were living in North Dakota, we had some friends from Dallas come visit us, and these are some city boys, and but they were very very excited. We told them like wear your hunting clothes on the plane because as soon as you step off the plane, we're going to a farm next door where we know the landowner. And sure enough, my husband picked him up at the airport, and he's like, "Where's your hunting clothes?" They're like, "Oh, we thought you were joking." He's like, "No, go put them on." And then they went across the street and shot their limit, and they were like, "That's how we do it." It was a really good year for bird hunting, but so they were like very excited and adventurous, but at the same time, like still like a little apprehensive. And I had mountain lion in the freezer that I wanted to serve them. And so that is definitely more on the adventurous side to serve somebody who's never really had wild game before. And so in those scenarios, like if you do have like a duck or a sharp-tailed grouse or something, um, or even if it's yourself, you're trying it for the first time and you're a little apprehensive, deer heart, tongue, any of those kinds of things. I always say start off with an appetizer because it's a lot easier to approach it when you're taking a bite of something instead of staring at the whole thing on your plate. This is your whole meal. I think it's just like way more approachable to start it as an appetizer. But as far as like, just a general like cooking something for first timers. I usually just cook something that I know and love that I've made several times before, but also something that so I know that tastes really good, but something that can be a little familiar to their palate. I think like you were talking about cream of mushroom soup. I think mushrooms and wild game, no matter the species, always goes great together. Um, like if it's a red meat, like I'll do mushrooms with like some bourbon in there, and butter. Or if it's a white meat like pheasant, I'll do mushrooms and cream, and rosemary or thyme or something like that. Something that's like familiar to them.
Mm. Yeah, if obviously, most people, almost everybody likes chicken. So if you have somebody that's brand new to it, serving them pheasant or rough grouse, something that's very similar to chicken might be a nice bridge. But also, I think back to when I was kind of getting my wife accustomed to the wild game stuff, it was really the deer heart that put her over. And we just did Hank Shaw's little deer heart appetizer, just charred on the grill pretty much real quick. And she really appreciated that. Then we got into some, venison ribs and stuff like that as appetizers. And the appetizer is really, just handling it that way really kind of got her on board to where she was open to trying new and more adventurous stuff, especially when you start talking about some of the liver, which I still, if you have a trick to liver, that's the one thing that I just can't really get.
For big game or birds?
Both. I've tried both, and I'm not a picky person by any means, but I cannot get liver to taste good at all.
I I don't love liver either. I'll be honest, especially from big game animals. I don't love it, but I think it's really nutrient dense, and I don't like it to go to waste. So this year, I gave a lot. I gave a we shot an axis deer. I gave a lot of it to my dogs, but I wanted to eat it because I'm pregnant, and so I wanted to get as much nutrient dense protein and iron as I can. And so I started to add it to sausage mixes, up to 20%. 20% I think would be max. Like 10% is a good place to start if you're a little apprehensive. And I added it to I made two different blends. One was just like a breakfast sausage, and the other one was chorizo. And the spices in it are strong enough that you would never know that the liver is there. The key thing that might clue you in is that liver can be really, really soft. And so it can make your sausage bind a little bit on the soft side. So you got to be careful with that. But as far as bird livers, I've always really chopped them up small and put them with a bunch of onions, garlic, peppers, and then added it to like hash browns and eggs. And you only need a couple in there. You don't need 10 of them. You don't want to eat that many. Just throwing a couple of them in there. And you don't have to cook it for very long, just for like a second. When you overcook it, that's when it starts to get really irony flavor.
Yeah.
But that's usually how I do that. And then I give some to the dogs too.
Yeah, that's kind of what I resorted to doing, was just kind of making dog treats out of them. I'll just kind of dehydrate them in the oven or smoker for a long while, and the dogs love it. But that's the one thing that I haven't been able to kind of get to where our palates appreciate. I've tried it. I've given it a good what for, but
And that's fine. I used to think how dare you give anything to the dog? Like how disrespectful. But I've kind of come to realize my dog works harder than I do. And they're better at it than I am, and they really deserve it. And I've hunted my dogs so hard that they're, poor thing, practically dizzy. If you've ever had one of those hunts where your dog is wiped out, and I'm like, you need to give them that liver. They need that. They worked really hard, so
yeah.
I'm all for it.
Well, getting back to the dog on Z, did your solo hunt kind of change your guys' relationship? Does he pay you a little more attention in the
Yeah,
field
it
now?
did. Yeah, it was everything I wanted because there was nobody else for him to look at
Right.
but me. But and He's, we drove up there, and it's like almost a day. Well, to Nebraska, it was only a day and a half of driving, maybe. And so we slept in the tent together, and his head was on my pillow. It was the whole deal. It was just, it was my, he's like my mama's boy anyway, but to like be out there in the field, like I mean, it was the best. I loved it. So yeah, I mean, if my husband is with us, he's still always going to look at my husband. But it felt good to know that I could go out there and hunt on my own and just kind of have that special bond with my dog too.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a different feeling when it's just you and your dog. There's no buddies, there's no family members. It's just the quote unquote success of the hunt hinges upon you and your dog, and that's it. Nobody else.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So as we kind of start wrapping this up, one thing I like to do at the back end of these episodes is I like to just kind of throw it to the guests, and they can kind of talk about whatever they want. And the way I phrase it is there something that I should have asked you that I didn't?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think we talked a lot about cooking with wild game, and hopefully I was able to sort of demystify a few things. I've done it for so long that it's funny. The more I cook it and the longer I do it, the simpler and this more just basic it becomes. And the same way with like processing meat, the way that I process birds, maybe yeah, maybe it's the time and experience doing it, but the more you just kind of simplify things,
Yeah.
not make it too fussy.
Yeah, absolutely. And the simpler, the better, in my opinion. Well, let's go down. Let's pitch your book one more time because it comes out on October 8th. It's titled Wild and Whole. I want to get your take for anybody listening. I want to hear Danielle's just fire recipes that like you don't have to say it's your favorite one, but if you're talking to my audience, bird hunters in mind, if they miss these recipes, they're kind of doing themselves a disservice. Is there anything that comes to mind on that?
Yeah, there's one, I'll admit it can be a little fussy, but if you like pheasants, this is one of my favorites is cocovine. It's a rustic French recipe where you basically cook the whole bird in red wine. It's very, very hearty. So, so good. It's a little time consuming in that, it takes a few hours in the oven to cook, and, you've got your carrots, onion, celery, and your red wine. And but it's a great meal to celebrate a hunt or to serve with other people. You can make a bunch of it in bulk and freeze it for later. I love that one for something that's like totally simple and basic. In the spring chapter, I have a turkey recipe that I actually make quite frequently with pheasant as well. It's just a cutlet, just like a super simple, pounded out, coated in panko breadcrumbs. And it's served with asparagus and morels. You don't have to use morels. You can use any other kind of mushroom, but it's just lemony and garlic, and then it just pairs really nice with that like fried crunch of the bird.
Love it. Well, Danielle, I appreciate you taking the time coming on here, kind of schooling us on something that can truly kind of be a little intimidating for people first starting out, especially that's unaccustomed to wild game meat. But if anybody listening to this, they want to find your book or see the link to Wild and Whole or follow you on Instagram, check the show notes in the episode. I'll have links to all that. And Danielle, I appreciate you coming on and spending time with us.
Thank you so much. It's been great.
Yeah, we'll have to do it again sometime.
Yeah, we'll have to go hunting.
Yeah, let's do that.